This is a video response to the user tooltime9901 on his video Racists in Canada. In this video, I should hopefully like to be able to point out many of his errors, contradictions, inconsistencies, and false characterizations. First off, I'd like to mention that anyone calling me a white supremacist or white nationalist or racist in this video is doing nothing more than using ad hominem fallacies as a red herring to draw attention away from what I am actually saying. I do not hold and do not claim to hold any of these positions. I've made this video for the purposes of having an open and honest discussion about race based on the available evidence and to correct many of the falsities uttered in Tooltime's video. Also, I will put links to the statistics and research I will quote in the video description. Tooltime starts off his video by referencing a group of people in Canada who were apparently having some sort of rally or march, the intention of which was apparently to display white pride or pride in their European heritage. On this issue, Tooltime says, quote, "These people are morons, because they can't figure out why you would have something like Black Pride or Black History Month or some other celebration based on being a part of some ethnic group. It's because in North America, where they are a minority, and historically and culturally they are discriminated against and put in some ways as second-class citizens. These are ways they can reaffirm their value to society that doesn't totally validate them. They have what's called a legitimate reason." Now, what Tooltime is doing here is actually a very clever rhetorical device. He's constructed a fictional debate where he attacks the positions of opponents who don't actually exist. And then he tries to associate these fictional positions with real people who attended the event in Canada so he can create a straw man of their position. No one is questioning why someone would want something like Black Pride or Black History Month. People do, however, question the social inconsistency of it being acceptable for non-white people to display racial pride, yet unacceptable and racist when white people do it. What he says doesn't even make sense. Why wouldn't it be the case that white people celebrating white pride wouldn't understand many of the same reasons as black people celebrating black pride? He also says that because some minorities in America are and have been discriminated against by the majority, that this somehow gives them what he calls a legitimate reason to exhibit racial pride. Now, does he say why this fact gives minorities a legitimate reason to exhibit racial pride? No. He just asserts this unequivocally because it's one of his subjective preferences. He also doesn't explain why it is illegitimate for a group that is not a minority to exhibit racial pride. He just implies it without any justification whatsoever. So it seems here that Tooltime is being inconsistent by applying different standards to one group and not to another. And this is why we have no reason to take what he says here seriously. Tooltime then goes on to say the following, quote, "Being white in North America makes you a part of the majority, the privileged class, and society is already structured in your favor. They don't know what oppression is or what discrimination is. There might be affirmative action or something like that in some jobs or schools. That this means that whites are discriminated against, this is complete and utter bullshit. White people in North America are not discriminated against. They are the fucking privileged class. If you are white and male, you're at the top of the social hierarchy in America, so sit down and shut the fuck up." Here, Tooltime does not define what being a privileged class entails, and how it is the case that white people in North America are supposedly privileged. He also doesn't describe what oppression entails, or give us any reason to believe that white people don't understand it. Then, he has the nerve to say that white people, meaning all white people in North America, aren't discriminated against. And this is patently false. Discrimination in a social context refers to the act of judging an individual or quality of an individual comparatively more or less favorably, or granting a greater or smaller number of rights based on some particular category, distinguishing characteristic, or trait. I a white person in North America, have personally been discriminated against in both the United States and abroad. I grew up in Hawaii, the only state in the Union that is not majority white. In Hawaii, many of the local Hawaiians refer to white people, especially foreign white people, using the racial epithet haole as a way to demean, degrade, and distinguish themselves from white people, and I've been called this innumerable times. People of Hawaiian and Polynesian origin have gone out of their way to insult me. They've even attempted to start several fights with me on numerous occasions, simply because of my race. I've even been assaulted twice by Hawaiians because of my race. This phenomenon has become so commonplace in Hawaii that on the last day of summer before school gets out, this day is sometimes unofficially referred to as Kilahaole Day, where non-white children are encouraged to harass and even to assault white children. In Japan, on at least 3 occasions, I have been refused service by Japanese businesses and asked to leave because I happen to be of European descent. Although, I have to say that of all the people who have discriminated against me, I certainly respect the Japanese most of all. Because when they did discriminate against me, they did it politely, up front, and didn't use harassment, intimidation, or violence, or the threat of violence. Furthermore, in the continental United States, I've had, on several occasions, people of Hispanic origin, who I didn't even know, harass and attempt to start fights with me because of my race. I could stop here, because, as Tool Time stated, white people aren't discriminated against as a universal. And as I am a white person who has been discriminated against, this demonstrates precisely why what he says is false. But let's drive the point home, shall we? If we look at affirmative action, something Tool Time asserts isn't discriminatory, without providing any justification whatsoever as to why, we can see that it is clearly an example of discrimination. Most people, at least those who don't stick multiculturalist mantras in their ears in order to black out rational thoughts, can see why this is the case. The Oxford English Dictionary defines affirmative action the following way. Quote, an action or policy favoring those who generally tend to suffer from discrimination at the expense of those who often do not, especially in relation to employment or education. Positive discrimination. End quote. Notice that the Oxford English Dictionary labels affirmative action as discrimination by definition. But if that's not enough significance for you, let's look at some actual statistics concerning how the status discriminatory policy of affirmative action negatively discriminates against white people and Asians, and positively discriminates for blacks and Hispanics. The National Policy Institute, in a 2008 study on the economic costs of racial and cultural diversity, found that affirmative action programs cost approximately 8% of GDP, or $1.1 trillion in 2007. As you can see by the following chart, Asians bore the greatest relative cost as a result of status discrimination, followed by whites, who bore the greatest absolute costs as a result of state discrimination. Furthermore, according to data compiled by the Color of Crime study, which used data from the National Crime Victimization Survey, done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, found the following. Blacks are 2.25 times more likely to commit an officially designated hate crime, which is discriminatory by definition, against whites than vice versa. Thus, when Tool Time says white people in North America aren't discriminated against, it is a matter of fact that he is wrong, and it seems rather foolish that he would feel the need to proclaim his view with such certainty, seeing that he is just talking out of his ass and never bothered to study the matter. Tool Time then continues his tomfoolery when he says the following, quote, I believe in being proud of things you've actually accomplished, or being proud of other people for things they've actually accomplished in their life. And I don't really consider being born white any sort of accomplishment. It's just a circumstance of history. That's just the way the dice rolled for me. I happen to be white. He goes on. What the fuck is the point of white pride? I don't get it at all. White people, yes, as far as I can tell, historically speaking, like gunpowder. Gunpowder was invented in China. It went to the Middle East and it was around for like 400 years. And then within a relatively short period of time in Europe, they were like, we could use this to kill people. Then we invented guns and steel, and then we went out and murdered and committed genocide on most of the rest of the world. Yes, I'm very proud of that as a white person. We stole all this land, we murdered all these people, we created the atom bomb, we caused 2 world wars, and we're responsible for the deaths of millions of people. Yes, white people, we've accomplished so much as a race. Colonialism, genocide, seriously, what is it that you're supposed to be proud of in terms of being white? What is the basis of white pride? End quote. Alright. First, I will outline why it is rational for people of any race to exhibit racial pride, as well as how it is the case that people come to exhibit racial pride, followed by outlining why what Tool Time is doing is misleading propaganda. Personally, I have not in my life gone around exhibiting racial pride or trying to be in the mental state of racial pridefulness. That said, I will say that it is generally rational for people of any race, not just white people or minorities, to exhibit racial pride, whether they are a minority or a majority. Why is this? It is because the opportunity cost of exhibiting racial pride is very low, and the benefits in terms of utility are very high. Now, what is opportunity cost? Opportunity cost is the value of the foregone course of action not taken when an individual or group has to choose between 2 mutually exclusive choices. For example, if I can either watch TV or go outside, the opportunity cost of going outside is watching TV. Now, let us assume, and I think most people here would agree, that the standard for an individual action being rational is whether or not the action produces the greatest amount of utility, happiness, and contentment for the smallest cost. We can even quantify this using numbers. We'll call them utils, happiness points, and we'll follow the convention that the greater the number of utils, the greater the number of happiness an individual experiences. Now, suppose I'm a Japanese man living in Japan. Suppose I'm trying to decide my best course of action, which will give me the greatest amount of happiness for the smallest cost. Suppose that the first one of my choices is to go to an Asian pride parade down the street. Keep in mind that Japan is extremely homogeneous, over 99% Asian. And keep in mind that if Tool Time is to be consistent, he would have to oppose any controlling majority population exhibiting racial pride. Suppose that successfully going to this racial pride parade down the street would generate for me 10 utils. Suppose also that my alternate option is to hire an instructor to take me rock climbing, so I can climb a mountain as a personal achievement. Suppose that successfully climbing this mountain would also generate for me 10 utils. Suppose that any option I decide to choose will be done for the duration of 4 hours. Now, which action is more rational and why? If we were to give a conservative estimate prima facie as to the costs associated with these 2 options, we might say the following. Hiring a climbing instructor might cost, say, $150, plus another $50 for renting the climbing equipment, plus $20 for transportation costs to get on the mountain. So, in terms of the cost for rock climbing, the rock climbing option, we see the following. Economic costs, $220. Time costs, 4 hours. Effort costs, significant. Risk cost, high. Utils gain, 10. In terms of the other option, going to the Asian Pride Parade down the street, what are the costs? Well, I'll be charitable and I'll assume I'll get lunch. So we'll estimate the cost as follows. Economic cost, $15. Time cost, 4 hours. Effort cost, minimal. Risk cost, very low. Utils gained, 10. Given this information, what course of action would we say is most rational? We would clearly say that going to the Asian Pride Parade is more rational because it has fewer cost and the same amount of benefits, whereas choosing to go rock climbing would have a very high opportunity cost. This example helps illustrate the general principle that it is rational for any race to display racial pride because the opportunity cost for doing so is so low, yet the benefits are high. Exhibiting racial pride is rational precisely because it does not require the members of the race exhibiting it to accomplish very much in order to receive significant benefits. Individuals who are members of a race have a natural predisposition to associate and form interpersonal relationships with people of their own race. Racial pride can help significantly to facilitate group cooperation, shared values, and a positive work environment. This view is supported by the research of professors of psychology David DeSerno and Lisa Williams, who teach at Northeastern University. They found that pride can play an integral role in enhancing cohesive group functioning by fostering confidence and admiration. Their research demonstrates that pride plays a considerable role in helping to foster successful interpersonal interaction. The participants in their experiment, who received pride induction, took on dominant roles and were perceived as more hands-on during the activity. In addition, their teammates viewed them as more likable than other participants who did not receive pride induction. This view was also supported by the Similarity Thesis, which is advocated from the research of scholars Buss and Yoon. They found that individuals who share similarities in terms largely of race and also economic class and educational standing were some of the prime determinants of relationship formation. The similarity thesis is the most frequently discussed and most strongly supported theory of relationship formation in the science of communication. General similarity, including racial similarity, can help reduce group tensions. Scholars Duck and Barnes argue that when someone is similar to us, this fact may help us in a general way to make fairly accurate predictions about that person, such as what knowledge is common cultural knowledge, general demographic information, shared preferences, and common values. The ability or perceived ability to make confident predictions about someone reduces uncertainty and anxiety, which may explain part of the disposition human beings have to favor similarity. There is also good evidence in the research of scholars Jones and Pelham for an implicit egotism being the reason human beings value racial and other kinds of similarity. When individuals share similar looks, beliefs, tastes, and values, this can be tantamount to validating oneself, and amounts to a sort of ego support. It's worth noting, however, that similarity can turn from attraction into dislike. Scholars Cooper, Jones, Taylor, and Meddy argue that when we encounter people who are like us in many ways, but who we find strange or offensive, that we have a strong distaste for this kind of similarity. For instance, you probably dislike others that people have said were just like you, but who talked too much, or were complete strangers, or had other unappealing characteristics. The research done by aforementioned scholars has shown that there is a strong tendency to dislike similar but offensive people even more than those who are offensive but distinctly different. This is what I would argue is largely responsible for Toole Time's hostility toward the people in Canada having a white pride march. He is similar to them in terms of race, geography, and cultural setting, but has very different preferences than they do. He obviously finds their behavior offensive, and this fact can be used to explain why he reacts so strongly toward them, and why emotion and not reason seems to get the better of him. Lastly, when Toole Time gives us a caricature history of white people and gunpowder, which he implicitly uses as an argument against having white pride, he is committing the fallacy of the one-sided argument. He attempts to give us reasons why he is correct, yet omits all evidence and reasoning to the contrary. Evidence of generally valued feats done by Caucasians, such as In addition to things like this, every event in history has trade-offs. So every honest portrayal of history will explain the trade-offs. Now, I'm not trying to justify colonialism here. Quite the contrary. I find it absolutely abhorrent. However, Tool Time has only vaguely mentioned some of the costs of European colonialism without revealing any of the trade-offs. In terms of cost and benefits, a fair look at history would reveal that there are also many significant economic benefits from colonialism, experienced by many of the peoples in sub-Saharan Africa, despite the hardships of colonial rule. Modern economics tells us that the three biggest absolute determinants of economic growth are physical capital, factors of production, human capital, the knowledge and ability of workers to perform certain kinds of labor, and technology. In sub-Saharan Africa, prior to colonialism, technologies like indoor plumbing, sanitation, engineering and modern infrastructure, written language, science, mathematics, industrialization, modern agriculture, specialization, and economies of scale were virtually non-existent. In this part of Africa, prior to colonialism, physical capital was extremely scarce, human capital was very basic, as there was practically no division of labor, and technology was quite primitive relative to Europe and Asia. European colonial powers, with the possible exception of Belgium, brought with them to the continent huge amounts of physical capital, human capital, and technology, all of which produced unprecedented levels of economic growth and rises in the standard of living for people in colonial Africa. Furthermore, colonial empires such as the British Empire generally provided basic institutional requirements for economic growth in their colonies by ensuring the rule of law, relative equality before the law, comparatively free trade, and the abolition of slavery. Moving on. Tool Time informs us of his relative ignorance of genetics, saying, quote, "What are white people supposed to be proud about? The fact that they are white? Okay, on a genetic level that means nothing. Genetically, the average white person is as genetically similar to the average person of any other race as they are to any other white person, if not more so. That's just not the way human genetics works. You're not smarter or better or culturally superior or anything like that. That's just a bunch of nonsense." First of all, I will freely admit that I am not an expert on genetics, and I will also admit that the subject in question is extremely complex. I do know, however, that it's not only the quantity of genes which determines the output organism, but also the specific type of genes themselves. Bonobos, for instance, which are great apes, also referred to as pygmy chimpanzees, have between 98 to 99.5% identical DNA to human beings. Thus, it is logically possible for one human being to have more in common genetically with a bonobo than another human being. Would we say a bonobo was a human being? No, we wouldn't, because of innumerable cognitive, behavioral, and phenotypical differences which would still be largely genetic in origin. The difference between an individual having Down syndrome or not is the existence or lack thereof of one chromosome. Children with Down syndrome have significant cognitive impairments, having an average IQ of 50, whereas the IQ of normal children is 100. Individuals with Down syndrome also have an abnormal set of facial and other physical characteristics. If you compare genetically a child without Down syndrome to one that had it, they would be as genetically similar to the average person of any other race. Would we say that a person with Down syndrome and one without it are practically identical? I think not. Modern science also has very good evidence that race is a factor in disease resistance or lack thereof. For instance, the genetic disorder Tay-Sachs has a disproportionate high frequency among Ashkenazi Jews relative to other races. Thus, again, the specific genes themselves an individual possesses also matters, not just the quantity of genes and genetic similarity. Thus, not only has Tool Time not given us sufficient reason to believe there's no significant genetic differences between different races, he's also given us plenty of reason to disregard all of its arguments entirely.